Today we're going to do a Maconochie Stew, which was either popular or unpopular with the troops during the First World War. It was originally made for the British Army in the Boer War. The contract still rolled over and they started doing Maconochie Stew again in bulk for the First World War. It was beef, carrots, turnip, onions, stock, and what the Americans would call navy beans, or we call Haricot beans, that went into it. When it was warm, the troops would say that the food was actually passable when it was warm, but when it was cold, it was an absolute man killer. But there was an awful lot of other soldiers as well who thought that the Maconochie Stew was an absolute stalwart. It was brilliant for them. So I'm going to show you a basic one, not a tinned one, but one that we're going to make fresh. Maconochie Stew is basically diced veg. I've done the carrots first, I've done the potatoes second, and now I'm doing the turnips. So I've been foraging the local farmyard, and I've got these. I've done a deal with the local farmer. I've cut them small because the infantryman had actually want his veg and potatoes as small as possible so that they're cooked far more quickly. It wouldn't necessarily be the same in a field kitchen. Soldiers could either eat as individual rations, or they could eat from field kitchens. Depended how the battle ebbed and flowed as to whether they were going to eat food and cook food themselves, or whether they would get it sent to them in flasks, in large flasks or hay boxes. So I'll continue to cut these into small dice, and I'll give you a little bit of background on the rations that a soldier would have got in the First World War, and it depended on what rations he got, to what time of the war it was. For instance, a soldier in 1917, the army was aiming to provide 4,193 calories approximately per man. That was in a frontline soldier. Slightly less if he were in his second line trenches, it was slightly less than that. And roughly that broke down to fresh or frozen meat, 1 pound of fresh or frozen, or 9 ounces of tinned, which would have been predominantly bully beef. Bread, 1 pound, or biscuits, 10 ounces. The biscuits would have been a hard-tack biscuit generally, which we'll do in another programme. Bacon, 4 ounces, which was generally Lance Corporal bacon, which is streaky bacon, which only had 1 stripe, so quite a lot of fat in it. Cheese would have been 2 ounces. Fresh vegetables, 8 ounces, sometimes more, depending on whether or not the soldiers or the cooks could go out and get more than that. Tea, 5/8 of an ounce. Jam was 3 ounces, and sugar was 3 ounces. There is another way to do this dish, which is to use corned beef. And what you'd do is you'd cook the vegetables off first in the stock, but you wouldn't add the corned beef until later on, much later on, into cubes, because otherwise you just end up with a pink mush in the bottom of the pan. So we wanted to try and keep it as solid as you possibly could in cubes, the corned beef. But with this, I'm trying to replicate what the tinned Maconochie might have looked like. According to the soldiers, one of the main problems with Maconochie stew was not the stew itself or how it was made. The problem was the quality of the foodstuffs that were used in it. They do say that some of the black bits that were in it were potatoes. There was an awful lot of gristle and fat to the meat, so they obviously weren't the best quality meat that you could get. I've made this setup as simple as possible. This is a modern number 5 cook set, an army cook set. And I've made it as simple as possible because during the First World War they predominantly would have used old buildings, farm buildings, outbuildings, because the chefs would have been preparing this behind the line to set forward in hay boxes or in flasks, food flasks. So a battalion kitchen was a simple affair. They only normally had 2 pans. Those 2 pans you would cook everything, which is why a lot of the soldiers complained about the food, that everything tasted the same. So if you can imagine you're cooking an all-in stew, and then right after the all-in stew, and food hygiene not being what it was in those days as it is now, people would just give it a rudimentary swill out and start to boil water up for a tea or cocoa, and you'd end up where the food, the dents inside the pan were containing parts of the food and the smell of it. So you'd ended up with tea tasting of cabbage, or coffee tasting of stew, and it was all the same. It all blended into one. So a lot of the soldiers did say during the First World War that things all seem to taste the same. So now I've diced my meat up, ready to go. So these are basically, apart from the haricot beans and the stock, the basic ingredients of the Maconochie stew. At this stage, I've dredged the meat and the onions with flour. The flour acts as a thickener when I actually fry it. First thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to saute and brown off the meat. The next thing I'm going to do is I've made some stock out of oxos, which they would have had in the First World War. We've sauteed the meat and the vegetables and potatoes together, and now I'm going to pour the stock into it. It will just be enough stock just to cover. As you see, it's just enough to cover. The reason for this is there's just enough potatoes and vegetables to absorb and slightly thicken this stew. The stews that they got in the tins were predominantly more of almost like a soup type stew, to be honest. They weren't a thick stew. I prefer mine a little bit thicker than that, so that's why I put a little bit less stock. The final ingredient to the Maconochie stew will be haricot beans. The Americans call them navy beans. We'll put them in last after this is cooked through because they're mush to nothing. So we'll put the haricot beans in almost about half an hour before the end of the stew. The beef is nice now and tender. The stew is almost complete. This is the tin of drained haricot beans, which I'm going to put into the stew, like so. I'll make sure all the bits are out. Which they now are. Gently fold them into the stew. Keep on the very, very low heat and leave that probably for about another 20 minutes or so. And that is a Maconochie stew complete. Now I'm going to try it. Maconochie stew. Really tasty. Simple, tasty, all in stew.